Start working on it. Okay, you're all set.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the February 23rd full commission meeting. As is customary, we'd like to start the meeting with a land acknowledgement. On behalf of the Seattle Planning Commission, we'd like to actively recognize that we are on the indigenous land, the traditional and current territories of the Coast Salish people, who have lived on and stewarded these lands since the beginning of time and continue to do so today. We acknowledge the role that traditional Western-centric planning practices have played in harming, displacing, and attempting to erase Native communities. And we can commit to identifying racist practices and strive to center restorative land stewardship rather than unsustainable and extractive use of the land. So welcome to members of the public. It appears that we have at least one here with us this morning. We are happy to make all commission meetings open to the public, but please note that the Planning Commission does not hold public hearings since we are an advisory body. We provide recommendations to elected leaders who in turn make the actual decisions, and we encourage individuals and organizations to provide their comments appropriately to elected officials. So this meeting is a hybrid meeting where some individuals are participating remotely and others are participating in person in the boards and commissions room at Seattle's City Hall. So next, I'd like to ask commissioners to review our revised color brave space norms. Thank you, that are now up on the screen. And I invite a commissioner to choose one to read aloud. Do I have a volunteer this morning?
Yeah, I'll volunteer.
Thanks, Matt.
Let's see. Create a space for multiple truths while prioritizing and believing lived experiences of racism.
Thank you, Matt. And if there are any amendments or modifications to these norms, please let me know. Otherwise, I suggest that we agree to them as we continue through this meeting. Okay. Thanks, everyone. So on the agenda today, we have one item, which is an overview of the proposed comprehensive plan amendments related to the industrial and maritime strategy. We, the commission, will be preparing a comment letter to City Council on these amendments for the consideration of Council. But before we get to that agenda item, we need to approve our meeting minutes from February 9th. Is there a motion to approve?
David will so move.
Thank you, David. Do I have a second?
Rose seconds.
Thank you, Rose. Are there any proposed changes or amendments to the minutes as drafted? Okay, hearing none, let's call it for a vote. All in favor of approving the February 9 minutes, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Are there any abstentions? Okay, thank you all. The minutes have been approved. So upcoming commission meetings. The next Housing and Neighborhoods Committee meeting is next Thursday, March 2nd from 7:30 to 9 a.m. Our next full commission meeting is scheduled for Thursday, March 9th from 3 to 5:30 p.m. And as is the case with this meeting, they'll be held both in person and via MS Teams. And now I'm going to pass it off to Vanessa for some additional announcements.
Thank you, Rick. I'm just going to go over the format of the meeting. And I apologize, I have a bit of a cough. During the meeting, there will be opportunities for questions and comments from commissioners. We will be using the chat function of MS Teams for all commissioners, including Michaela, who's here with me in the boards and commissions room of City Hall, to join the discussion queue. I'd like to remind commissioners that the chat function is not for substantive discussion, but rather to be recognized to speak. Please remember to put your name in the chat to add yourself to the queue, as well as to note what your comment or question pertains to. This will help Rick and myself facilitate the discussion so we can have a fluid discussion that follows a train of thought as opposed to popcorning around different subject areas. I've received one public comment that I emailed to you all prior to this meeting. I will go through 2 minutes of reading through it at the end of the meeting, which is our public comment time. And for members of the public listening in, that public comment will be included in our minutes, which we will approve at the next full commission meeting. Just a reminder that we will be recording this meeting this morning, our first, and posting the meeting to our website. Please note that these recordings are not in lieu of our minutes, which are the formal record of our meeting, and they are, as I mentioned, approved at the next full commission meeting. I'd like to thank everybody for your patience, commissioners, as well as members of the public, as we are trying to shift into yet a different format with using MS Teams so that commissioners can use their personal emails instead of emails that personal or work, instead of those that have been assigned by the city. And so as we are making that transition, some commissioners continue to experience challenges joining these meetings. So thank you all for your patience in that. I'd like to take just a moment to give you all a heads up about commission leadership. So each year, the commission, you all elect your leadership. That would be the co-chairs of the commission, as well as the co-chairs of our Land Use and Transportation Committee and our Housing and Neighborhoods Committee. I'd like to thank the co-chairs for this past year for their service and leadership. Co-chairs are eligible to serve 2 consecutive years in their specific leadership position. Rick and Jamie have done so as co-chairs, and David Goldberg has done so in his role as co-chair of the Land Use and Transportation Committee. I'll be sending you all an email asking for your nominations for the leadership positions. And please note that you may nominate yourself, and you may also nominate a fellow commissioner without checking with that commissioner first. I will collect all the nominations and contact the individuals who receive the top nominations for each of the positions. And then you all will take a formal vote on the full slate. That would be the 2 commission chairs, co-chairs, 2 co-chairs of the Land Use and Transportation Committee, and 2 co-chairs for our Housing and Neighborhoods Committee. That vote will take place at our March 23rd full commission meeting. So please do be on the lookout from an email for me and respond as soon as is convenient for you. Please feel free to contact me should you have any questions. And you may also reach out to current co-chairs directly if you have any questions regarding their roles. And with that, I am going to turn it back to Rick to start the introductions. I'll then call on commissioners by name to introduce themselves, and we'll conclude with staff. Per our discussion at our last commission meeting, we are going to skip over the icebreakers this morning, as this is one of our shorter meetings, and we'll resume them at our longer meeting, the next of which is March 9th. So with that, I will ask Rick to introduce himself.
Thanks, Vanessa. I'm Rick Moeller. I co-chair the commission with Jamie Strobel. I use he, him pronouns. I live between Wallingford and Green Lake. I'm an architect and I teach in the architecture department at the University of Washington.
Thank you, Rick. Jamie.
Good morning, everyone. Jamie Strobel. I use she, her pronouns, and I live in the future 130th Station area and work in climate change and environmental justice and policy. And yeah, I'll pass it on.
Thank you, Jamie. David.
Good morning, David Goldberg. I use he, him pronouns, live in the Wallingford Urban Village. I work for the State Department of Transportation.
Thanks, David. Radhika?
Hi everyone, I'm Radhika Nair. I use she, her pronouns. I live in Wedgwood, and I'm an urban planner.
Thank you, Radhika. Matt?
I'm Matt Hutchins. I use he, him pronouns. I'm an architect. I live in West Seattle.
Thank you, Matt. Michaela?
I'm Michaela Daffern, she, her pronouns. I live in Capitol Hill and I work in affordable housing policy and planning.
Thank you. Dalton?
Hey everyone, Dalton Owens, he, him pronouns. I live in the Ballard neighborhood, and I work as a project engineer for a general contractor.
Thank you. Rose?
Good morning. This is Rose Luchelowitz and I'm Rose. My pronouns are she, her. I live up north in Licton Springs and I work as a professional wetland scientist and permitting specialist with Jacobs Engineering.
Thank you, Rose. Julio?
Hello, my name is Julio Sanchez. My pronouns are he, him. When in Seattle, I live in Capitol Hill, and my areas of interest are community engagement and equity.
Thank you. Lauren?
Hi everyone, Lauren Squires, she, her. I live in Mount Baker and I'm a multimodal transportation planner.
Thank you. Caleb?
Good morning. My name is Caleb Twilde. He, him pronouns. I live in Columbia City and I am an educator.
Thank you, Caleb. Deanna?
Good morning, Diana Quintanar. I use she, her pronouns. I live in Capitol Hill and I work on a variety of multimodal transportation projects and infrastructure.
Thank you all. We'll now turn it over to staff. Robin? Robin McGonigal?
Robin McGonigal, staff to the commission. I use she, her, they, them pronouns, and I live on Vashon Island.
Thank you. Olivia?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Olivia Baker. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm staff to the commission.
John?
Morning all, I'm John Hoy. I use he, him pronouns. I'm staff to the commission.
Thanks, John. Good morning, everyone. Vanessa Murdoch. I use she, her pronouns. And I'm staff to the commission. And with that, turn it back to Rick.
Thanks, Vanessa. So we'll now turn to our main agenda item, which is a discussion of the Industrial and Maritime Strategy Comprehensive Plan amendments. We have an hour and 5 minutes for this item. Staff will provide an overview of the proposed comprehensive plan amendments related to the Industrial Maritime Strategy to be considered by City Council this spring. This is the first of 4 meetings when we will discuss, develop, and approve a comment letter on the proposed amendments for the consideration of City Council. So following John's overview, I will facilitate our discussion by first asking each commissioner on the in the meeting for any questions or clarification. If you do not have a question, feel free to pass, and I will circle back to you at the end of the question portion for our discussion. So following questions, we will begin our discussion. Please note your name and general topic issue of your comment in the chat. Vanessa will assist in monitoring the queue and ensuring all commissioners have the opportunity to participate in the discussion. So I will turn it over to John for his overview.
Thank you, Rick. I as well have had a really bad cold, so I will try not to cough, but I do recognize that I sound very froggy. I'm going to try after the presentation to not do as much talking, so bear with me as we get through these slides. Olivia, you can go to the next slide, please. So just in terms of background, as you all recall, we have been reviewing the Industrial Maritime Strategy project for several years. And just in terms of recent background, as a reminder, back in last September, the final environmental impact statement was released for the industrial maritime strategy. We had an overview of the FEIS by Jim Holmes of OPCD staff at our October Land Use and Transportation Committee meeting. In January, we had a very similar presentation on from Jim Holmes, providing us an overview of the final EIS results, as well as introducing the comprehensive plan amendments that are proposed for this spring. Then on January 26th at the full commission meeting, we had a preliminary discussion just to start the wheels turning as we think about reviewing and commenting on these proposed comprehensive plan amendments. Next slide, please. So I did send out a link for you all to the proposed amendments. I will share that link on the next slide, but I just want to talk about our timing for our review. So today we will have an introductory discussion now that hopefully you've had a chance to review some of the amendments, and I will be going through them. At the March 9th full commission meeting, we will introduce a staff draft letter based on your comments on the proposed amendments. At the March 23rd full commission meeting, we will have a discussion on a revised draft letter based on comments at the March 9th meeting. And then the goal is to take action on a final draft letter at the April 13th meeting. It is important that we take action on that final draft letter because the City Council's Land Use Committee will be taking up the proposed comprehensive plan amendments for the industrial maritime strategy in late April. They tentatively have a public hearing scheduled for their April 24th meeting. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, I did send out a link to the text of the proposed amendments. They are embedded within the final environmental impact statement document. That is the easiest way to review them without me trying to copy, paste, and deal with formatting. So if you go to pages 47 to 53 of Chapter 6 of the final environmental impact statement in the appendices, you will find the proposed comprehensive plan amendments. There is a link on the screen, and I can send that out again after this meeting for you all to review. I encourage you to spend time reading, reviewing, thinking about these amendments, and to prepare for your comments. Next slide, please. So just for a little background and framing for our discussion, we did have a preliminary discussion at the January 26th commission meeting, and to prepare for this discussion, we just wanted to remind everybody that we will not be discussing the specifics of the industrial maritime strategy itself. However, well, as background, those recommendations for the industrial maritime strategy were vetted and forwarded by a stakeholder advisory committee. They were documented in a final report, and they were studied in both the draft and final EIS. These proposed comprehensive plan amendments are the first step in adopting and implementing the recommendations of the industrial and maritime strategy. Next slide, please. In terms of the actual amendments, the majority of the proposed amendments are in the land use element of the comprehensive plan. The way they are structured, you will see that they are in underline or strike through mode, so it's easy to tell what has been either introduced or revised based on the previous comprehensive plan. Additional minor edits are proposed in the container port element land use policies. And then also the industrial maritime strategy does touch the shoreline areas element, which does contain land use policies for industrial land adjacent to Seattle shorelines. There are no specific changes proposed, but those are relevant to implementation of the industrial maritime strategy. Next slide, please. So getting into the specific proposed amendments, as an overarching goal in the land use element, 2 new goals are introduced. One, to support employment-dense emerging industries that require greater flexibility in the range of on-site uses and activities, and another to develop transitions between industrial areas and adjacent neighborhoods that support healthy communities, reduce adverse environmental impacts, and minimize land use conflicts. So those are the 2 new goals. And then for those of you who are familiar with the structure of the comprehensive plan, after goals, the plan does get down into more specific policies. So next slide, please. And there are several new policies and revisions to existing policies. I have not included all of them, but definitely I've introduced here the vast majority of the proposed changes that are of interest to the commission. Some of the others that I have not included are really minor, maybe showing the name of a zoning change or a new category or something like that. In terms of policies, a new policy, this is completely new. Anything that's underlined in total is entirely new. Policy to ensure predictability and permanence for industrial activities in industrial areas by limiting changes in industrial land designation. There should be no reclassification of industrial land to a non-industrial land use category or amendments to the boundaries of manufacturing industrial centers, except as part of a city-initiated comprehensive study and review of industrial land use policies, or as part of a major update to the comprehensive plan. That is a policy that the commission has been very supportive of over the years. So some of you may recall and be pleased to see that in writing. Next slide, please. I'm not going to read the full text of all these, but this is the policy that introduces the 3 new zoning categories for the future land use map and zoning. So transition to the following zones for industrial lands in Seattle. These are the 3 categories that we've heard about consistently throughout our briefings on the industrial maritime strategy. First, the maritime manufacturing and logistics. That is the most, the majority of industrial land would be proposed for this category, and that is the one that most closely relates to port facilities, shipyards, freight rail, shoreline access in terms of locational criteria for maritime manufacturing and logistics uses. Next, the industry and innovation zone is the zone that is intended to promote emerging industries and leverage investments in high capacity transit. So those areas are generally within 1/4. Those are areas within the mix and are generally within 1/4 and 1/2 mile of high capacity transit stations. That's how it reads. So those are considered for the industry and innovation designation. Next slide, please. The last new category is the urban industrial, and this designation is intended to encourage a mix of uses, a small scale industrial makers and art spaces. This is the buffer category between industrial and other areas, commercial and residential areas. Lastly, there is a new category, sorry, not a new category, but the industrial commercial is referenced here because that is now being designated for industrial land located outside of the manufacturing industrial centers to permit a range of activities such as light industrial uses, research and development uses, and offices. Next slide, please. So getting into some of the more specifics of either new policies or revisions. So this one, prohibit new residential development in industrial zones. This is an older policy that has been amended to say to allow new residential development in urban industrial zones with dwellings targeted to workers that are related to the industrial area. Next slide, please. This policy is oriented towards avoiding placing industrial zones within urban centers or urban villages. The new text reads, consider using the urban industrial zone, which is one of those new categories, in locations within or outside urban centers or villages that borders a manufacturing industrial center to help provide an appropriate transition and promote complementary land use patterns between industrial and non-industrial activities. Next, please. So this policy is about limiting the density of development for non-industrial uses in the manufacturing industrial centers. New text reads, permit a limited amount of standalone commercial uses in industrial areas as workforce amenities. Strictly limit the size of office and retail uses not associated with industrial uses in order to preserve these areas for industrial development, except for areas eligible for the industry and innovation zone. Next slide, please. The next policy is about parking and loading requirements. I'll just read the new text at the bottom. Consider limiting parking in the industry and innovation zone located in the vicinity of high-capacity transit stations. Next slide. This policy is to maintain standards for the size and location of vehicle curb cuts and driveways in industrial zones, to balance the need to provide adequate maneuvering and loading areas with availability of on-street parking and safe pedestrian with a new addition of bike and transit access. Next slide. Another completely new policy. In the industry and innovation zone, consider development regulations that are compatible with employment-dense, transit-oriented development. Seek to establish development standards that ensure employment density at a level necessary to leverage transit investments. Next slide. In the industry, another new policy, in the industry and innovation zone, consider development standards that promotes development that meets the needs of industrial businesses, including load-bearing floors, freight elevators, and adequate freight facilities. Next slide. One more new policy related to the industry and innovation zone. Consider an incentive system whereby non-industrial floor area may be included in a development as a bonus if new bona fide industrial space is included. Next slide. This policy has been amended. Instead of establish the industrial buffer, it states, consider using the urban industrial or industrial buffer zones to provide an appropriate transition between industrial areas and adjacent residential or pedestrian-oriented commercial spaces. Next slide. Another new policy related to the urban industrial zone. Consider allowing a range of ancillary non-industrial uses. Recognize that industrial businesses in this zone have a greater need for a limited amount of space for such uses as tasting rooms and retail facilities that directly support the industrial activity of the business. Next slide. Another new policy related to the urban industrial zone. Consider establishing buffer standards to ease the transition from industrial areas to urban villages and other non-industrial parts of Seattle. One more. This is the last of the new land use policies. Recognize the unique development opportunities that the Washington National Guard Armory in the BINMIC, Ballard Inner Bay North End Manufacturing Industrial Center, and the WASCA, Washington Oregon Shippers Cooperative Association represents. Work with the state of Washington or other future owners of this site to develop a comprehensive industrial development plan. This plan should include green infrastructure, consolidated waste management programs, and workforce equity commitments. Next slide. I lied. There's more. Land use in the land use element. An amendment to another existing policy to limit the development density in industrial, commercial, and in the maritime manufacturing and logistics zones in order to reflect transportation and other infrastructure restraints while taking into account other features of the area. Okay, next slide. So that's it for the amendments to, those are the majority of the amendments to the land use element. The container port element is referenced with a few minor revisions to policies. But for reference, the container port element contains land use, transportation, economic development, and environmental policies to guide and support container activities in Seattle. The land use policies specifically emphasize ensuring adequate land area needs for port expansion, avoiding land use conflicts. These policies focus more specifically on the maritime industry than the land use policies that I described above. Next slide. So a minor revision to one of the container port element policies is to discourage non-industrial land uses such as standalone, new addition, standalone retail and residential in industrial zoned areas to minimize conflicts between uses to prevent conversion of industrial land in the vicinity of cargo container terminals or their support facilities. Next slide. Another revision to a container port element policy reads, consider the value of transition areas at the edges of general industrial and adding the maritime manufacturing and logistics zone, which allow a wider range of uses while not creating conflicts with preferred cargo container activities and uses. You can read the rest. Next slide. And then lastly, the shoreline areas element is referenced because as part of the Shoreline Master Program, the shoreline areas element contains land use policies for industrial land adjacent to Seattle shorelines. These policies are implemented through the Shoreline Master Program, which designates which shorelines are industrial in use and establishes development regulations for those uses within 200 feet of the shoreline. So no specific policies were proposed to be revised, but there was recognition that this element is relevant to implementation of the industrial maritime strategy as well. Next slide, please. So just as a reminder for our timeline, I look forward to hearing your comments in the discussion today. Based on comments today and in previous comments in other meetings, a staff draft letter will be prepared on the proposed comp plan amendments. We want to limit our comments to the proposed comprehensive plan amendments. We will have a discussion on that staff draft letter at the March 9th meeting. We will revise the draft letter as necessary and discuss that at the March 23rd meeting. And then again, on April 13th, it is important that we take action on a final draft letter to forward it on to the City Council Land Use Committee as they take up these proposed amendments. With that, I open it up for comments and discussion.
Thanks, John, for powering through that. Really appreciate it. So as we mentioned, what we're going to do is we'll start to see if there are any questions first, questions regarding what John just presented, and then we'll move into the discussion. And so I'm just going to go down the list here. If you don't have any questions, you can simply say pass. So I'll start with Lauren. Okay, Lauren, now I'm going to check the chat here. Okay, Caleb has passed. Rose has passed. Julio.
Julio passed.
Thank you, Julio. David has passed. Michaela.
Pass.
Thank you. Dalton. Dalton, any questions? Okay, I will move on to Radhika.
I have a question about policies that don't create the land use framework. These policy additions in the comp plan seem to create the land use framework that was considered in the EIS, all of the land use designations and things like that. But are there other policies that are being added that are non-specific to creating the land use framework, but maybe clarifying some goals or things like that?
The proposed amendments that have been they were in the final EIS. So I have shown you almost everything that is proposed. The vast majority of them are in the land use element, and the only other two elements that are referenced are the port container and the shoreline areas. That's it.
Got it. Thank you.
Thanks, Radhika. Jamie.
I'm still formulating my thoughts, so pass.
Okay, circle back. Matt, looks like you have a question.
Yeah, this might be ancillary to this conversation, but did they? I didn't see that they selected a preferred alternative in the draft EIS. I'm assuming it's alternative 4, but is that true? Do you know, John?
They did select a preferred alternative. I don't recall which number it is, but it's in the FEIS, and these proposed amendments are based on the preferred alternative.
Okay, all right, that's it.
Thanks, Matt. Deanna.
I guess, I don't know if this is a question or a comment, but I guess one thing that, and of course I'm not a subject matter expert, nor have I a great grasp or understanding of what it would mean at ground level, but in the amendment around container areas, preventing any retail in those areas, I guess my only question is, those are areas that become increasingly uninviting to walk or bike around. And I am wondering if there's, any responsibility on ensuring the pedestrian environments around those areas that become completely barren of any ground level activity, whether there's incentives or there's requirements or obligations to ensure a more safe and inviting pedestrian environment around those areas. So I guess it's more of a comment question, but that's just one thing that stood out to me since I myself have biked around those areas.
Deanna, just to your comment, I only referenced 2 policies that are proposed for revisions from the container port element. There are it's a selection of a much larger number of container port element policies. I'm not familiar whether there are policies in the comp plan related to things like safety, but we might consider taking a look at the broader element to answer your question.
Thanks, Deanna. I'm just going to quickly circle back. Dalton, just wanted to make sure you don't have any questions, and curious if Jamie has formulated a question or anyone else in the interim. Okay, it doesn't sound like it. So we can now begin our discussion. So if you'd please put your name and the general topic issue into the chat, Vanessa will help monitoring this. So Jamie.
I did that too soon. Let me add a topic. Hold on.
Or you could just say what the topic is. But you're the first in the queue here.
I'm interested in the housing piece as well as the buffer zone. I'm talking about that. You're on mute, Rick, if you're talking.
Thank you. I was talking. I was suggesting, since you're the only one in the chat, Jamie, I was suggesting you just go ahead.
It's kind of a question, but kind of a thought too. There was one of the land use ones where it was talking about housing targeted to, and I'm curious about that language choice in particular, because that doesn't really put as kind of strong of a limitation on the types of housing that we're hoping to have. And I know that in the past, some of us on the commission have been very concerned about housing in industrial areas, and I feel like that the way it's currently worded might be opening that door even further, since it's just more of a like, we're encouraging. So I'm sorry, I didn't write down exactly which one it was. This one, yes, thank you, John.
That's Olivia.
Olivia, thank you, Olivia.
Slide 17.
So I would love to hear, John, if you know anything about kind of the choice of the wording here. And then I noticed that Rose also has a comment related to this topic.
I don't know anything about the choice of wording. You know, it's obviously a revision to an existing policy.
Yeah.
So the way that these edits were shown, they did strike through when they removed language, and they did underline when they added new language. There were places where they had shown changes that were made between the draft EIS and the final EIS. I did not include those for simplicity of presentation, but those are in the document. So my understanding, this is just a simple revision just to add the potential for dwelling units only in the urban industrial zones. Jamie, I hear your comment being about the targeted to workers.
I think it's mostly about the addition of that language as a whole, and I see an attempt to kind of like narrow the focus, so it's not just we're opening up all housing in urban industrial zones by saying like, oh, we're just going to target towards workers, but I don't like target doesn't really create any like strong boundaries around it, and so I kind of just or requirements for that matter, right? So I I'm just wondering if this, because before it was certain types of dwellings and caretaker units, and then by adding this language, are we then opening the door a lot wider to having housing within this zone? So that's and I know it's a new designation too, so that's what I'm asking. And I know that looks like Rose and Lauren has comments on this same topic as well.
Yeah. Julio is next in the queue, and then I'll move to Rose and Lauren. Julio.
So it's kind of strange as Jamie's comment was really very close parallel to what I wanted to bring up. And it's that in my time in the commission, in our time in the commission, we have often seen interested parties come to the commission and say, you know, if you only let us change this little bit here of the industrial lands, or this, if you move this boundary just one more block. And all of this basically points towards the fact that we're always going to be in a push and pull between the land owners, the building owners that want to extend or have some flexibility added to their buildings that happen to be in the industrial land. As I'm hearing the language and the things proposed, I keep thinking of the many ways that some of these well-intended proposals could be used to the advantage of someone that wanted to expand or change or get some flexibility in the property. I know this is going to sound probably ridiculous, but if you think about somebody saying, well, you know, I could propose to build a 5-story building in which 4 of those stories is going to be housing, and the main floor is going to be creative industrial with a wine tasting room. Can I get my foot through the door and get my building approved or the use of my building changed? So all of this to say that I think that there are places in this language where creative people could find ways to insert their very specific agendas for property or for zones to be manipulated. So it's just a general thought. And strangely enough, it was going really close, or it's going really close to what Jamie and I think others were saying. That's just my general observation.
Thanks, Julio. Rose is next.
Hey, yeah, so I kind of flagged the same language as being very strong, and maybe if we propose something like intended for workers and then add some more restrictions, that it might be more palatable. I was also noticing that we had previously talked about making it super clear that no one should be allowed to live in industrial lands unless they sign something that says they are aware of all the risks, right? So I'm wondering if there's a way we can craft language around that, because I feel like opening up housing in industrial lands is risky if people don't know what they're getting into.
Rick, can I or Vanessa comment just on this thread?
Of course.
I just want to remind everybody that these are comprehensive plan policies. These are very high level policy level statements. The details for implementation would be fleshed out in much more detail in development standards in the zoning code. So I think that the types of details that you may be looking for would be more appropriate for inclusion in the zoning development standards. But I do appreciate the comments on this high level language. And we can certainly share that. Vanessa, do you have any other comments on this?
No, thank you. Thank you, John.
Okay, thanks, John. Lauren.
Hey everyone, thanks for bringing up this topic, Jamie, to kick us off. I hear you, John, also in that these are high-level comp plan policy statements. I also see that the first statement of this policy is prohibit new residential development in industrial zones. And so for me, that is the top level, and I feel like that captures the intent. And I wonder if in our letter, we can encourage OPCD to kind of couch more context in this policy statement. I don't know what the precedent is for that, to be able to say, just to be very explicit about the legacy of environmental injustice in industrial lands and who has been forced to live near and in industrial lands, particularly South Park and Georgetown. And so just to say, I wonder if there is an opportunity for a little statement at the beginning of this, like in an effort to well, there was a policy that said like to encourage healthy communities and maybe John, you can go to that one. That was kind of the more positive frame of where housing related to or near industrial zones. I think maybe it was talking about the buffer area, but I think that we could work on this as a commission, but just to really explicitly be clear about the disproportionate impact of environmental harms on communities of color and low-income workers that would be the folks that maybe would have to live in these areas. So I think that we could together frame the environmental justice component of this. But John, could you maybe flip, or Olivia, flip back to that? Whatever policy statement had the word healthy communities in it, really, I thought was well worded. Would like to look at
I'm
again.
looking for that. It may be the policies related to the urban industrial zone are starting on slide 25. I'm looking for something about healthy communities. I don't see anything. There are 3 policies proposed for the urban industrial, which is where this housing proposal would fall. So slide 25 is consider using the urban industrial or industrial buffer zones to provide an appropriate transition. So there's that one. The next one is consider allowing a range of ancillary non-industrial uses. If you see something that you were
G12.
What's that?
Someone put LUG12 in the chat.
Oh, okay, let's take a look. Slide 19.
Okay, well maybe I don't think I'm making this up, but
I'll drop it in the chat.
I just appreciated the intent. Yeah, here we go. Develop transitions between industrial areas and adjacent neighborhoods that support healthy communities, reduce adverse environmental impacts, and minimize land use conflicts. I really appreciate the articulation of the intent. Who's live presenter 28?
What
This is
policy
Michaela,
number is
that's
that?
me, and I have the EIS appendix open, so I can only tell you it's on page 47. It's at the very beginning of the list of underlined policies.
It's
like
slide
bold.
12, John.
Slide 12.
Yeah, that's all
Okay.
you needed to know. Sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, good.
This is great.
Okay, so it's in the goals. So that's one
In
of
the
the
goals.
overarching
Okay.
goals.
I wonder if we recommend that a goal, like just either add a new goal or explicit about an existing goal about housing in industrial zones. You know, this really talks about the transitions, but I think the commission has a strong kind of stance that the reason we don't want housing in industrial zones is because that has resulted in disproportionate burden, usually on low-income and BIPOC communities. So I think that we could explicitly articulate that either in a goal or a nuance to the policy that we were just looking at together, but we can determine the hierarchy together. But that's all I had.
Thanks, Lauren. And thanks, John, for the clarification, sort of the procedural clarification. I mean, overall, I'm supportive of the intent of this, but I, like other commissioners, get a little bit nervous about some of the language. And you know, I understand that this is high level. I understand that the land use code itself has yet to be written, but I get nervous with things like, quote, such as, unquote, caretaker units. Caretaker units are already established thing in the land use code that have a very strict limitation. And so is that intended to provide flexibility to better fulfill the intent, or is it providing kind of wiggle room? It's the wiggle room that makes me a little bit nervous. You know, we've heard about, you know, quote, bona fide, unquote, industrial and what that means. But again, I think it's going to be critical that that really be dialed in so there's not much wiggle room. Rose brought up the question of understanding what it is to live in an industrial area. We already have that in the land use code related to artist housing. So I don't know how we frame it, but to say that we understand the need for flexibility, but we also want to prevent unintended consequences from unintended loopholes. And that needs to be addressed in subsequent levels of the discussion. And sorry, I just had one other question. Is one thing that we've been very concerned about is that we simply prohibit any kind of auto-dependent retail, strip malls. Where is that covered in CP 1.3? Or is that adequately covered elsewhere? Because in CP 1.3, I think it uses the term consider, as opposed to, or, you know, discourage non-industrial land uses. Or is this specifically related to cargo container terminals, or is there another place where we will literally just put a cap on the development of new auto-dependent retail? Where is that covered?
I'm scanning just to go back to slide 13 is where so this is the policy that that gets at the one thing the commission has been very vocal about consistently, which is ensuring predictability and permanence for industrial activities by limiting changes in the land use designation. That's basically, that will prevent the annual amendments to the comp plan that we have seen over the years. It will limit changes to industrial lands
to say IC, to industrial commercial, for example.
So I'm just wondering if that gets at your question, Rick.
Okay.
Or if
it might get to it. I just wanted to make sure that there was something that was explicitly going to prevent that from happening moving forward.
I mean, I think with the new zones, the 3 new designations, that it's pretty clear what is intended for within each of those 3 zones, and then also with the 4th, calling out industrial commercial specifically, that is for industrial land outside of the mix.
Yeah. Okay.
That will allow light industrial research and development uses and offices. So, but we can clarify with OPCD about specifically how retail will be discouraged or prevented.
Okay, thanks. Michaela.
Yeah, so I feel like Lauren and Rick, Jamie, Julio, others have kind of said things that were on front of mind for me. I do think that the thing I'm struggling with is that this language clearly does provide wiggle room, and I think that there are intentional consequences to the wiggle room that's being provided through the language changes. And kind of at a high 20,000 foot level, it seems really concerning, but I'm trying to remind myself that there's an underlying strategy and plan that has shown us a roadmap for what the intent is behind some of this wiggle room that's being provided. And I'm having a really hard time wrapping my head around each of these policies and which zone it's applying to and why they're trying to put that specific sort of allowance into the language. And so broadly speaking, when I see these comprehensive plan amendments and their totality, I feel like they are allowing a fairly substantive shift in what is allowed in our industrial zones in a way that I think is inconsistent with what I've heard in previous planning commission meetings. But then I'm trying to wrap my head around the actual scale and impact based on the strategy that they're tied to. And are some of these things that are so worrisome to me when I sort of hear them early morning in a meeting, are they smaller in scale, or are they more thoughtfully designed in the strategy than I'm remembering? So yeah, and then I want to be respectful also of the process that the advisory group that I can never remember the name of, industrial lands group that got together to come up with these recommendations. And I'm having a hard time tracking how closely it is aligned with what it is that they supported. And so I just remind folks that the version of the EIS that John linked to in his email highlights changes, I think, recent changes in gray. And that's helping me a little bit, I think, understand that maybe the non-gray underlined new text is sort of consistent with the plan that we commented on about a year ago. And then the gray stuff are sort of new provisions. So I don't know, my comment is, yeah, I'm nervous. This all makes me really nervous. And I'm not sure how I feel about the direction we're going with our industrial lands, but I also know that I wasn't in all those conversations, and I'm not an expert on how our industrial land needs are evolving and changing. And so I'm very much welcome other folks' opinions. I'm trying to absorb and learn and keep an open mind with this. Thanks.
Thanks, Michaela. Radhika.
I wanted to ask a question and make a comment about tribal values in fisheries and areas of cultural significance within the industrial lands amendments. I know that's something we pointed out in the letter, and I was wondering if there's a goal that's been strengthened or policies that have been added. They don't necessarily operationalize the new land use framework that was in the EIS, but just curious about whether there are any changes. And if not, whether we could suggest that there be one.
In everything that I shared with you this morning, I haven't seen anything that that meets that request, but I think it's worth us calling out if that's something meaningful to the commission.
Great, thanks.
Thanks for that, Radhika. Jamie.
I wanted to, before I ask my question, I wanted to just circle back and say, I think what I'm hearing from Julio and Rose and Michaela and Lauren and Rick is that, I think that it's important to recognize that high-level policy guides implementation. And so I think that's why we're really driving into what is this language potentially creating wiggle room for? because having been on the implementation side in previous roles, I know that like how that gets interpreted really matters. And so the guiding language is really going to have to be clear on what the overall intention is. And I just think like we have to be really mindful of the precedents we're setting, because this is going to really fundamentally reshape the city in many ways. And I think I share Michaela's sentiment of feeling nervous about the direction we're headed, recognizing that, you know, we are changing as a city and we need to adapt to those things, but at the same time, like, how do we do so in a way that we're ensuring the health and well-being of the folks that live and work here? So just adding that, the question I had was related to Lauren's comment about buffers, because I saw there was one, and apologies, I didn't write down the number on it, but there was one that struck out establish a buffer and said consider using these areas instead. It was like the very first line was struck out establish a buffer. And to me, I'm like, is that in contradiction? Because there were some other ones that like 10.22 that says use a buffer. And so I'm like, is this just like replacing that with like what types of zones could be used for the buffer? And it's just clarifying that? Or is this kind of like removing the requirement to establish a buffer? And it's just saying consider it. That's my question. Because this relates back to all of the other things we talked about with transition zones.
So it's not a rhetorical question, Jamie. It's a question.
Not a rhetorical question.
Yeah, okay.
I'm asking, does anyone else like read it that way? Are we?
Yeah, yes. When you write policy, either if you want it to be a specific requirement, you start with a word like establish or use. If you want it to be flexible, you use words like consider. So I feel like there's some intention behind that, but I obviously wasn't the author of it, so I don't know. But
Got it. We can clarify the intent behind this. My reading, I understand your concern with the use of the word consider. I think the intent of the sentence is that there is a new zoning category introduced, which is the urban industrial. So there is a choice between the urban industrial or the industrial buffer zone for this purpose, but we can ask for more clarification on why this was written the way it was.
Thanks, John. So we have Matt, then Rose, then David, and we have 10 minutes left in this discussion. Just a heads up.
Okay, I went into the FEIS and just like where they have projected the housing is in Ballard, in Inner Bay, near Dravis, and then in Soto and Georgetown, which there's currently residential units in those same areas. I feel like this is like what they're projecting for the growth is a natural extension of kind of a vibrant mix of the industrial uses and what I think is going to be some more office, more entrepreneurial spaces, more maker spaces with housing. And so because those places are also generally going to be co-located with light rail and mass transit, I feel pretty I'm okay with the establishment of the uses and the amount of housing that they're projecting, and so therefore I feel like the text in the comprehensive plan amendments makes sense, and I feel like they've studied it. I'm not not overly concerned that this is going to be a slippery slope, because I think that those all are going to lead to strong neighborhoods and support the sort of employment densities that they're trying to achieve with this strategy. I agree that it isn't like this sort of bright line between industrial and housing uses. That's going to get blurred. However, I feel like the the evolution of what industrial uses are is going to, I think, in general, mean that there are less impacts to future residents.
Thanks, Matt. It looks like Rose is allowing David to go first.
Yeah, I guess my whole struggle with this is around this whole idea of buffer zones. What is a buffer zone? And if you're working in a buffer zone, if you have activity in a buffer zone, if you happen to be one of the places that maybe has some residential in the buffer zone or right next to this so-called buffer zone, to me it's super squishy, and this conversation is a little abstract because I have a feeling if we looked at the map, every single area that you would identify as a buffer zone has its own interesting characteristics. If I think about, for example, the brewery district in Ballard, I have no trouble living over there, even though there's activity, industrial-like activity going on. I think language of land use 22 is, I think it should be struck altogether and completely reconsidered, because first of all, there is nothing, I don't see an industrial buffer zone designated per se. I might have missed it. I've gone through it a couple times to try to find it. So I think this whole buffer zone concept is super squishy and is a potential area for problem. I don't have the alternative language to suggest right now, but I think there could be better and more explicit language. And this consider using as a transition, what does it mean? What does it yield? And when we're talking about next to pedestrian-oriented commercial zones, I think it's really important that we understand what the characteristics of these places are and have a little bit more intentionality around them. So raising an issue that I don't have a solution for right now in terms of actual language, but I think if we're going to be helpful in a letter, we should have some idea of what we'd like to see in place of particularly land use 22.
Thanks, David. Going to pass it back to Rose.
Hey, so I actually re-looked up the definition of industrial land use in the approved comp plan to remind myself what it currently allows. And I'm wondering if maybe some of our conversation could also use reevaluating the definition for industrial land use, and also highlighting that caretaker is not actually defined, and maybe if we were to propose some sort of definition for caretaker units or dwelling units within industrial, that it may help with some of our issues. Because right now, industrial land use is actually pretty broad, including production, distribution, and repair of goods. And then it specifically calls out heavy industrial, like factories and such, but it would clearly still allow under this definition things like, bakeries, ceramic shops, all these other things that are light industrial in quotes. So yeah, I guess just saying maybe we should look at that definition again.
Thanks, Rose. I do think caretaker unit is limited in terms of its size. It's been a while since I've worked in that part of the code, but not necessarily in terms of type of use. Radhika, this will likely be our last question.
I have a procedural question about the changes or the letter that we might write to the city. Essentially, the comp plan amendments are operationalizing the concepts that were studied in the EIS and responding to some of the comments that on the DEIS. So things like balancing housing in industrial areas with access to transit and leveraging transit and things like that. Is our intention to kind of change or offer suggestions for changes to the language of the policies, or is our goal to offer ways in which the implementation or the land use code could better respond, or like better regulatory concepts?
Veronica, I think the primary purpose of our letter to City Council is to offer your recommendations on the language that has been drafted in the proposed comp plan amendments, just as you said, to operate, can't say that, to implement the maritime industrial strategy that was studied in the draft and the final EIS. I think in the context of offering comments on the specific language that has been drafted by OPCD, comments can be included, such as, we understand that these policies are high level and will be interpreted further through development standards, and offer a caution that as those development standards are drafted to make, to minimize wiggle room, we'll say it a little bit more eloquently than that. But the intent of we've been asked by City Council to provide recommendations on specific to the comp plan amendments that have been drafted by OPCD. We're not revisiting the FEIS or the preferred alternative. You all can include in your letter of recommendation concerns you may have, how these policies get interpreted. But the purpose of the letter is not to revisit the FEIS or the preferred alternative, but rather to focus on are these policies going to implement the intent of the preferred alternative.
Okay, got it. And there are no regulatory concepts that the city is proposing at this time. Is this coming?
Sorry, my understanding is that these comp plan amendments proceed by necessity. They have to proceed further regulatory changes because the comp plan needs to have the goals and policies in place in order to make those finer grain changes that will appear in the land use code and the and zoning.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay, Julio, looks like you'll get the last word on this discussion. And John, we have a request. Thank you. Go ahead, Julio.
So thinking about people living in these places that are going to be hypothetically built in the borders between industrial land and residential neighborhoods, there are parts of the language that say that you will have to be worker on an industrial, one of the industries. How do we assess that? Are people going to have to fill some kind of affidavit that says that they work with such and such industry? Will workers only be allowed to apply if they work with a pre-approved list of industries that are working in that area? So the intent is good, but then how does the enforcement live up to that intent when anyone can possibly apply to housing in this borderline? And once these people are in, it sounds great to live near the beer making places in Ballard, but if there is a truck making a delivery at 4 o'clock in the morning and you start complaining about it and your neighbors then form a committee, how do we preserve the spirit while at the same time preserving or serving the letter of the intent? That's the end of my comment.
Thank you, Julio. So to close out, we have one public comment, and just as a reminder, the Commission provides time for public comment at all meetings, but we do not hold public hearings. As we are an advisory body, we make recommendations to elected leaders who in turn make the actual decisions, and that individuals or organizations that make comments to the Commission should remember that the mayor and the city council make the decisions, and we encourage them to provide their comments appropriately to elected officials. So Vanessa.
Thank you, Rick. I am going to read the beginning of a slide deck that I forwarded to all the commissioners, and for members of the public who are listening, that will be included as an attachment to our minutes that will be approved from this meeting at our next meeting on March 9th. The email to which the slide deck is attached reads, Vanessa, I hope all is well. Attached, please find a deck that we have sent to Tim Burgess and the staff at OPCD asking for some minor changes in the proposed rezoning efforts. For a variety of reasons detailed in this deck, we feel there are incremental changes to the boundaries and some small clarification in coding language that will make the overall venture much more successful. So I will now read the beginning of the slide deck. And this is SODO zoning refinements. SODO property owners' recommendations. The property owners in the SODO are committed to working with the city on sensible new zoning improvements and appreciate the positive steps forward in the final EIS. After careful review, we have minor boundary changes that would make redevelopment more feasible and are all within a half-mile walkshed of the SODO station, thus improving TOD. We've identified 2 recommended changes in the industrial FAR building code that will lower cost, better meet market demand, and reduce the carbon footprint of new development. We look forward to continuing the dialogue. And I'll just refer the commissioners to that slide deck that has maps and specific requests for expansion for modifications to the zoning. And that comment comes from, from Ted Lehman, Stack Family Properties. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. And with that, I think we can draw our meeting to a close. So thank you all for an interesting discussion, and I look forward to it continuing as we work on our letter to council. Thanks all.
Thanks all.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.